Okay. Our next speaker is Jean-Paul Rubies. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct.
Very good.
Okay. Jean-Paul Rubies is ICREA research professor at Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. He did his doctoral research at King's College, Cambridge, and was until quite recently reader in international history at the London School of Economics. He has also been visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études. He is currently leading a research project on ethnographies, religious missions, and cultural encounters in the early modern world. Professor Rubies is the author of the monograph Travel and Ethnology in the Renaissance South India Through European Eyes, 1250 to 1625, and the collected articles Travelers and Cosmographers, Studies in the History of Early Modern Travel and Ethnology, as well as numerous essays and edited books. He is currently writing a new monograph with the title Europe's New Worlds, Travel Writing in the Origins of the Enlightenment, 1550 to 750, to be published by Cambridge University Press. A book in Spanish, Misioneros Etnógrafos, is also forthcoming from Acantilado. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And first of all, can you hear me? Yes. First of all, let me thank David and Jose for the invitation to come to Mexico again, which is lovely, and also especially for assembling scholars who work on India, who work on China, who work in Japan, and who work on the New World, which we will hear tomorrow. So I think that it's a very kind of fruitful approach to be able to consider what's going on in these different areas. And precisely that is going to be the focus of my talk. I'm going to be talking about ethnography as a form of cultural translation in a comparative perspective. So even though I did work on India as you heard, the fact is that today I'm going to be spreading more widely. So I'll begin with a little story. Yesterday had enough time to go to the Museo del Templo Mayor in the center of Mexico City. It took us ages to get there and to get back, but I mean it's a wonderful museum. And one thing that struck me at the end of the visit is that besides the wonderful material remains that you have, the museum continuously goes back to extracts from the works of Bernardino de Sahagún, Fray Toribio Motolinia, Diego Duran, and other missionary ethnographers, as they call them. But there was at no point in the whole museum any hint of the idea that these could be sources that are problematic. So whilst the material remains and their interpretation was subject to debate, the authority of the missionaries as providing the key to understanding those objects was never questioned. At the end of the museum, there was a room devoted to the history of the archaeological digs, and in that sense there was a self-reflection. The archaeologists were being reflective about their own discipline, but they were not being reflective about ethnography as a source. So I'm not kind of trying to be critical about this wonderful museum. I recommend you go and see it. I think that was, for me, a good way to begin today by talking about Mexico as well, which is the fact that ethnographic knowledge is a particular kind of knowledge bound to particular cultural assumptions. And the project I'm dealing with now is to think about ethnography as part of cultural history, as a particular kind of knowledge bound to cultural assumptions, and then to try to connect that understanding of the cultural assumptions that belong to a period and that belong to particular aims, such as in particular the aims of missionaries, which is a religious aim of conversion, to connect that to the problem of cultural translation, because what ethnography fundamentally does is to provide an access to other cultures, either through description or through linguistic research, which is fundamental to the interpretation of other cultures, to, in some cases, all kinds of hybrid cultural products based on the knowledge of language and the description of customs. So clearly, ethnography is a strategically important kind of narrative knowledge of the early modern missions. We know that, of course. I'm not saying anything you don't know. I'm just asserting it as a starting point for thinking systematically what is then the nature of ethnography as a kind of knowledge, or perhaps even a kind of science. And in this respect, I mean, we've heard quite a lot about science today in relation to astronomy, in relation to mathematics, but for early modern humanists, and of course the humanists were very much the leading intellectuals of the period, the science was not just what we now call the physical sciences or the mathematical sciences, the natural sciences. Science was any kind of knowledge which was rational, structured, and based on some kind of empirical evidence. They didn't have the idea that some science is kind of real science and some science is some kind of soft science. I think that there was much more equilibrium between, there was much more balance between what we could call the human sciences, what José Acosta would call moral science and moral history, and what he would call the natural history. What would then characterize early modern science and ethnography as a kind of scientific knowledge would be, first of all, the empirical nature of that knowledge, the fact that it was based on a personal experience or a personal acquaintance with evidence. And I think that in that respect, missionary ethnographers were without any doubt, scientific. I mean, they did other things than collect evidence, but they definitely collected evidence. Second, the second element that I think that makes it call missionary ethnography scientific is its systematic nature often, some more than others, but many missionaries organized information according to clear categories of knowledge, and they were systematic in the way they approached describing other societies or learning about their culture. Going back to the case of New Spain, Bernardino de Sahagún, for example, clearly interviewed his informants with questionnaires and then assembled information according to 12 books that had a thematic structure. But more generally, one of the fundamental genres that made ethnography possible, and that's true not only for missionaries, but also for lay ethnographers, of course there were lay ethnographers as well, is the relation. And the relation is a genre which was a descriptive genre that organized information about other cultures according to specific categories, like the location of a kingdom, the size of the kingdom, the temperament of the people, the climate, the political system, the laws, the system of justice, the everyday customs, marriage customs, funerary customs in some cases, and of course with variations you find an idea that information has to be systematized. So I think this is the second element that makes ethnographic knowledge kind of scientific in an early modern sense. And finally, the third element is the one I already mentioned before, and that has also been very important in today's discussion, is the role of linguistic research. The fundamental originality of early modern missionary ethnographies is the extent of engagement with non-European languages. It was no doubt a central concern of the Catholic orders in the way they recruited people and sent them to the Indies, whether the West Indies or the East Indies, whether under the Portuguese patronage or under the Spanish patronage, that they were willing to learn languages. We find people like Martin de Rada who would come to Mexico, to New Spain, as they would call it, learn Otomí, and then a few years later go to the Philippines and learn Tagalog or Visaya, and then he would be sent to China and try to learn Chinese. I mean, this man had tried to learn 3 entirely different languages in the space of a career. And he's not alone. Someone was kind enough to mention Antonio Rubino, with whom I worked some years ago. He's another example. He goes to India, he begins working with Telugu because he's sent to the court of Vijayanagara. The whole thing collapses within 2-3 years. Then he goes and works in Tuticorin. And then at the end of his career, he's trying to go to China and Japan. So basically, these people are on the move, willing to engage with many traditions. That language was central, not just as a methodology, but also to the way they thought about interpretation is essential to almost all the missions we look at. I mean, whether we look at, for example, Matteo Ricci, the way he understands language, not just a way of understanding China, but a way of talking to the Chinese, and the way of penetrating the system with interpretations about the nature of Confucianism, for example, just makes essential being able to read Mandarin Chinese, classical Chinese, and to separate different stages in the history of China. Well, the same could be said of Bernardino de Sahagún. I'm going back and forth between regions because I'm trying to be very, very comparative. His whole history of the things of New Spain is a linguistic key to culture. I mean, he's not trying simply to describe Nahua, the culture of Mexico. He's trying to understand the concepts. He thinks that recording the concepts and interpreting them properly, the different meanings, is essential to understanding the beliefs and to deciding what is idolatry and what is not idolatry. So the linguistic element, therefore, I think, is perhaps the most fundamental in calling, in defining the nature of ethnographic knowledge, especially in the case of religious ethnographies. And here I would like to make a distinction between the lay ethnographies I referred to in passing and the ethnographies produced by missionaries. Lay ethnographers like the famous Duarte Barbosa, Tomé Pires, or many relaciones written by Cortés and other conquerors of the New World are fundamentally concerned with exoteric description. They will describe cities, kingdoms, armies. They will describe trade. They will describe customs, and they may be based on knowledge of language, like, for example, Duarte Barbosa knew Malayalam, or not. They could be just based on reports by other people. But at the end of the day, they do not aim at an internal interpretation of the culture as much as a kind of description of what you can see and the rules you can work out by observing behavior. That's the emphasis, is emphasis on behavior. What I think distinguishes missionary ethnographies is the idea that that's not enough, that you need to go inside. And what makes that necessary for missionaries is precisely that they're trying to engage in an apologetic process. They want to convert, they want to preach, they want to convince, they want to refute. And for that reason, and they want to understand better who they're fighting against. They know who they're fighting against. They're fighting against the devil. They need to know better where the devil is hiding. And for that reason, they need to know the languages. And that is what I would say distinguishes missionary ethnographies. Now, so far, this all sounds like very much like in praise of the great achievements of the missionaries. And that I meant it to begin like that. Now we're going to the problems. And there are some very, very significant problems. The first one is, I mean, again, I'm not inventing anything here. I'm just going over things that have been studied by people in different fields, but I think it's worthwhile bringing together. The problem of reliance on local informers. How much of what a missionary knows is what the informer tells the missionary. Even in the case of missionaries who know languages, they almost invariably are working with local informants. And interestingly, mostly informants who happen to be Christian converts or who might be Christian converts soon. That is to say, there is an issue there about a shared complicity with which in some ways might lead the missionary to constructing false knowledge. And this is true of so many examples. Whether we look at Abraham Roger or Ziegenbalg, two Protestants, or Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, two Protestants working in South India, or whether we look at Nobili with Shiva Dharma, or whether we look at Matteo Ricci with his converts, with whom he brought books, many books he signed, he probably could not have written alone, or whether we're looking at Bernardino Sahagún, or before him, Andrés de Olmos, or Motolinia. We are talking about missionaries who interview and who work closely with other people. We know particularly well how Bernardino de Sahagún worked because he describes it. And we know also how other missionaries work quite well. But in the case of Bernardino de Sahagún, I think it's particularly clear. I mean, they have a whole school devoted to teaching the conquered elites, the children of the conquered elites, Latin, grammar, and Christianity, and the elements of European culture that they consider suitable. And then they use these people, the same people they're teaching, as the key to interviewing the older inhabitants of the Mexican cities who remember and can read the old books, the glyph books, and then they go from the old books and the oral traditions connected to those books, to the Nahua books, to a transcription in Nahua language with Latin script. And then, only then, we move on to the translation into Spanish. And each of these steps involves all kinds of mediations, negotiations, and transformations. And this has serious implications, the fact that many of these converts are, the informants are people who have a kind of a stake. Whether they have converted out of pure enthusiasm for the new religion, or they have converted because there is a logic of local power that makes it worth the while if you have been conquered by the Spanish to actually convert to Christianity rather than kind of be treated as very badly if you don't do. The fact is that you have a good reason to collaborate and to participate in the creation of shared knowledge. And in the case of many of the issues that appear in these, for example, the emphasis on monotheism that appears in a lot of research about Hinduism, which is a topic that many of the scholars around the table who have worked on how the Jesuits approach the interpretation of Hinduism have noticed, is that there is a very strong desire to find a monotheistic core behind all the ridiculous, irrational fables of Hinduism. But also, interestingly, we find the same in China, with the idea of finding in Confucianism something that is not an alternative religion, but is somehow compatible with natural religion, with natural monotheism, with the Thomistic belief that monotheism is something that's a rational truth, not just a truth of faith. Then we move to Mexico, back to Mexico, and we find exactly the same. We have a desire to find a maker of the world, or you go to Inca Garcilaso in Peru, and again, a desire to find a kind of identification of the sun with a maker, a creator figure in Incas. So there is here a very definitely cultural bias that comes from Europe, that comes from Christianity, which is the desire to find this monotheistic core. And then when we look at the way this is being done, it's a very creative process. It's not a natural process. We know, for example, that Andrés de Olmos, when he collected the kind of the moral teachings of the Mexica, he specifically told, according to Mendieta, he specifically told his informers to not mention the gods, the Quetzalcoatl's and other gods of the Nahuas, but to instead talk about God, Mary, and the saints. So there is he wants, in order to make that useful knowledge, at that point, something, because of course, one interesting point here is that the moral teachings of the Nahuas were considered something acceptable and even admirable by the Franciscans. Was they rejected idolatry entirely and were obsessed with eliminating it. In parallel, they were keen to emphasize positive aspects, especially the moral teachings of the Nahuas. They wanted then to produce a discourse that was clean of idolatry and that would have the figure of the maker there. So here we find instructions to the informers to just already do that. And in the next step, when Sahagún translates from Nahua into Spanish, he also changes some of the things, again, to make it more compatible. So there is a progressive adulteration, if I could say it, of the native culture in this process. It is, to me, quite clear that in the case of India, there was a basis for this monotheism, which was the Vedanta philosophy. And at the same time, it was difficult to find that in the Vedas. That's why the question that David raised about the extent to which people acknowledgedly knew the Vedas is interesting. Because the question is, did he not know anything about the Vedas, or did he not like what he heard about the Vedas because there was not enough of the elements that were useful for his agenda? Because the later Upanishads and the later kind of medieval philosophy, which is monist, were much more useful in order to create the kind of bridge that would allow the rational foundation for Christian faith that was the fundamental strategy of many missionaries in these dialogues. Then, I mean, that is one problem then. I cannot continue talking about it in detail. I just want to say that this is absolutely essential to assessing how scientific or reliable is that knowledge. The next problem is, of course, that the aims of Christian missionaries are apologetic aims, and that affects very much the way they construct their final products. First of all, who are the audiences here becomes central. Rhetoric is about making knowledge kind of available to audiences according to the needs of each audience and according to the aims of the speaker. And clearly, rhetoric was the key to the education of these missionaries, whether they were Franciscans or Jesuits or others, although there were variations. I mean, you could say that perhaps the Jesuits were more imbued with humanist rhetoric, classical rhetoric, than others in some cases, but ultimately they did place rhetoric at the service of an apologetic aim. And that often meant different rhetorics for different audiences. And that is where the big problem of accommodations come into place, which is the next point I want to talk about. If you are building a discourse that works for a Chinese audience, or for a South Indian Brahmin audience, or for a Nahuatl audience, or for an Otomi audience, you basically construct a particular kind of discourse. And then you choose which elements of your culture will resonate and which elements of the local culture are acceptable. The problem with that is that you cannot use the same rhetoric everywhere. My interpretation of the rights controversy is that it is a clash of incompatible rhetorics. The rhetoric that works in China is incompatible with the rhetoric that works in Europe, basically. You cannot keep the discourse in Europe about what Christianity is in parallel to the discourse that will work in China, even if it's just a temporary discourse, it's just for the time being until they have the faith. The fact is that you end up creating a construct, Chinese Christianity, that will not be accepted by others. And the same in India. I mean, you will find that what nobody is doing is not acceptable to other Jesuits, is not acceptable to many in Goa. And in the end, it is up to Rome to decide. So I think that the problem then of reaching a public is really conditions fatally the nature of the discourse that the missionaries construct, both about the culture they're interpreting and about the culture they're presenting. And here, let me go to the next point, which I would like to emphasize, which is that we're talking here about not simply the imposition of a European culture on other cultures. We're talking about the negotiation. The negotiation takes place in different contexts. Of course, if you're negotiating in a place you have conquered, you have much more room to maneuver. That is the situation in New Spain. If you're negotiating in a place where you are there because the Emperor of China allows you to be there, or because a particular Chinese governor is sympathetic to you, but he doesn't really know what you're up to very much. He thinks you're some kind of Buddhist monk or something similar in the beginning. I mean, you have to gain credibility. Then in that context, of course, the negotiation is very different. And I think that almost all the negotiations, I mean, all the cases generate particular kinds of negotiations, and where the figure of the informer or the collaborator becomes in some ways a key element. I think that the research of Eric Zurcher into Giulio Eleni and his missionary strategies in Fujian is particularly illuminating, because what he has unearthed and published and analyzed in my view very well, is the extent to which the Jesuits did not really hide, as they were accused by rival orders, all the contents of Christianity. They did kind of like transmit them gradually. I mean, the Passion of Christ, for example, those things. They did introduce them gradually. Accommodation, in that sense, was not about hiding as much as introducing gradually those truths. And if there was a plan that began with Ritchie and then continues with Eleni, there is a coherence to the plan. You first emphasize natural monotheism. You gain credibility by engaging the Chinese in their own language, with their own values. You write books that any Chinese could have written with some elements of Western culture, but that you make sound as traditionally Chinese as possible, and then you make allies of the Confucian elites, then you make some converts, and then you get tolerance. Once you have tolerance, you go to the local level, and then you want to preach then to the lower elites, which is what Eleni is doing. And then you spread the message much more effectively, and you make many more converts. And at that level, you are introducing a much more faith-based religion, interestingly. So you can see that Eleni is doing that. However, and this is the second part of what I think Zurcher has demonstrated, you are also adapting to these other local elites and their expectations and their requirements. And what Zurcher has published is the interpretation by some of these kind of lower literati elites of their dialogues with Giulio Eleni. And then what you have there is different agendas to the ones that you get when you look at the European sources. And you could say that in some ways here there are two kinds of agendas that have to converge: the local agenda and the missionary agenda. And there are red lines on both sides. And the question is whether you can find a common ground without breaking the red lines that exist on both sides. And the problem is that those red lines may work in a context, but going back to what I said before, stop working when you go to another context. So that's the real difficulty of the job. I realize I only have 1 more minute left, so I'll just finish with 2 more points, which is I would like to emphasize something I've published about in the past, but I think it's very relevant here, which is the extent to which accommodation was not about liberal dialogue. It was not about we all come together valuing all religions and all cultures, and I learn from you and you learn from me, and therefore we can share views. It was clearly a targeted operation. You want them to become Christians, you need to know how to do it, you need to gain acceptability, you decide which things you can say, which things you cannot say, which customs you have to adopt, which you cannot adopt. It's extremely calculated process. I call it Machiavellian because I think that there was a doctrine in Europe at the time that described exactly what you were doing, what accommodation was about. It was not exclusive to the Jesuits. There were different kinds of accommodation. The question is how far you were willing to go, or you had to go in order to work. I think that the reasons why the Jesuits get in trouble is because they go farther and they take bigger risks in some cases, especially in China, but also in South India in the case of Nobili. But there was also accommodation at different levels in almost all the missions. The Dominicans, the Augustinians, the Franciscans, they also made their own accommodations according to the requirements of each context. And the final point is, and that really is just one line, is that one other way of interpreting this ethnography as a kind of knowledge is to say, well, at the end of the day, Europeans were unable to ever truly understand any other cultures than their own. I mean, the idea that at the end of the day, they're talking different languages, and they are trying to, but failing to meet. I would say that the evidence we have really questions that picture. Of course, perfect understanding of another culture is something that you might never achieve. But in fact, I don't think that any member of any one culture has perfect understanding of a culture as a complete system. We all have fragments of cultural systems that we live with. And we also negotiate cultures within as well as without. So I think that the way to understand these processes is by understanding all cultures are flexible and with fuzzy edges. And the question really is, how far do people go into moving from one to another culture in order to achieve particular aims? And how far do they come in coming together? And I think that you could argue that Aleni has succeeded in creating a new kind of culture in Fujian with his converts. The problem is that it is not Christianity or Chinese culture. It's something specific that may only work for a few people in a particular area for a while. I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, we'll have questions.
When you said, okay, so we have a, what is the problem? You started talking about the problem, and then you said, literally, that the missionaries, with the help of their informants, ended up constructing false knowledge. Okay, you didn't say false knowledge, because what is true knowledge, and why would, with the help of local intermediaries, informants, this kind of knowledge be false? Wouldn't it be even more true than? But what I'm trying to say, British constructed false knowledge about India. Today, Hindutva is constructing another type of false knowledge about India. So we are not in the false or true. This is something that the Protestants basically thought that the papists' trickery produced this false knowledge. We don't have to use this game. And actually, when you talked about Wittgenstein and the language game, this was a typical Wittgensteinian language game that they were playing. The playing of pretending, the game of pretending, and the game of, there are myriads of language games you could play. So are you really standing by the false knowledge? No,
totally. It was
Okay.
it was a bit of a journey. You see, I started saying that these are very scientific people. Then I'm saying that in fact they don't really are understanding entirely these other cultures. And then of course at the conclusion, I meant to conclude by saying that in the end, it's not about either true or false knowledge as much as I say, cultural systems are not kind of self-enclosed stable, perfect systems of knowledge. However, you could say that at any product you can judge in different ways in relation to a particular standard. And in that respect, what it is important to emphasize is that this is mediated knowledge, and this is negotiated knowledge. And this is, if we have an idea of science as a kind of true representation of an external object that's based on evidence, when I would say, well, obviously in that respect we don't have that. We have something of a different nature.
Historians of science wouldn't.
Yeah, of course, historians of science would agree that no scientific knowledge is like that, but not everybody, that's a subject for debate, actually. I'm not going to go into now debating it in terms of mathematics of astronomy, but it's just fascinating. I think it's a fascinating debate how far we go in that direction. Yeah.
It's just because we always talk about, what the Jesuits did or did not know. And then compared to, let's say, British Orientalists and what was done later, it always looks like this is a really faulty knowledge. Not just necessarily false, but faulty. And actually, it was a situated knowledge of a particular kind, so maybe...
Yeah, well, I would say it was situated knowledge with some limitations always, some constraints, yeah, which in some cases were much more dramatic than in others. In the case of Phoenicia that was mentioned, clearly, compared with others, he is going very far in learning about the Ramayana, for example. From another perspective, his knowledge of astronomy and cosmography is quite limited compared with what other people in Europe at the same time would have had. So it's an example of, it depends how you look at it. It's an achievement or it's kind of mediocrity.
We have time for one more question before the next one.
Of knowledge, interchange Laboulaye, I don't know if you know, is a French traveler, 1653.
So can you read the name again, please?
Laboulaye.
Oh, Laboulaye, oui, yeah, I do, yeah, of course, yeah.
So, and he speaks about a tailor, he shows him a print of a virgin, and the tailor tells him, oh yeah, I've seen, this is the goddess Sita that is worshipped in Versailles, and Laboulaye also always speaks of gods as saints. I just want to say that the level of fluidity of exchanges might have been great, great.
Yeah, I agree with you, and also I think it's very important to appreciate when talking about travelers like Laboulaye or François Bernier or others, the extent to which they are not imposing a Western assumption or ideology as much as actually sometimes just sharing stories with local people. And a lot of what goes on as kind of like Western fantasies are often Oriental fantasies of one group of Orientals in respect to others. In the case of Bernier, for example, his engagement with Hinduism, I believe, is entirely conditioned by his conversations with the Persian Muslim, with whom he shares many values in relation to Hinduism. So I don't think there is here a European interpretation of Hinduism as much as a European shared understanding to some extent of Hinduism, because they make fun of the Hindu together with the Muslim, basically.
Thank you very much. I think there's more that we may want to discuss about all of this, but we will have at least a little bit of time at the end of the speakers. So our last speaker today is Dr. Will Sweetman, who will be talking about the Veda and European thought. Dr. Sweetman is Senior Lecturer in Asian Religions at the University of Otago, New Zealand. His primary field of research is European accounts of Indian religions in the period before the establishment of colonial rule. He has taught at universities in London and Newcastle and held research fellowships at the University of Halle in Germany and the University of Cambridge. His books include Bibliotheca Malabarica, Bartholomew's Siegebold Timor Library, I don't have my glasses, and Mapping Hinduism and the Study of Indian Religions, 1600 to 1776. Okay, thank you.
So we come at last to the Veda. Everything's in the Veda, it'll solve all our problems. And for me, this is something I've been meaning to look at for a while, and eventually got around to this year. But I think I hope it'll address some of the questions David had about the Nobilis' knowledge of the Veda, but also this question of faulty knowledge or limited knowledge, I think is relevant here. So I just want to begin by acknowledging a couple of previous works on this question. The first is by Willem Calland, who was a Vedic scholar of some note in the early part of the 20th century. And then late in life, he developed an interest, as many of you I'm sure will know, in early European accounts of Hinduism. And in 1918, he published a Dutch account, The History of the Discovery of the Veda. It's a slightly heroic account of European enterprise, but it's a very full account of certainly the published sources that mention the Veda, and I rely on it quite heavily here. He did, however, think that the first mention of the Veda in a European source was in The Three Impostors, this famous imagined text which was attributed to all sorts of people before it was written. And it's interesting that for Calland thought that the reference to the Veda in this text, which he dated to 1538, must have come via Arabic accounts of India. And I think he thought this because Averroes was one of the putative authors of this text. In fact, however, the reference to the Veda in this text is now taken as part of the case for thinking that it must be much later than its supposed date, which you see here on the printed version. It's 1598, but in fact it was printed in the middle of the 18th century, and the text finally probably appeared only in 1688 in manuscript as an act of filial piety by Johann Müller, whose father was accused of having the text, and when one of his father's contacts asked the son for the text, he went away and wrote it. Is how I understand it. In any case, the date, the false date here, 1598, is actually very close to the actual date of the first European text to mention the Veda, which is Diogo de Couto's Decades da Asia, written, completed in 1597, although not published until 1612. So despite this red herring, however, as I said, Calland's survey is pretty accurate. But I want to supplement his account here with some further references to manuscript sources which he didn't have access to. But I also want to contextualize his focus on the Veda by consideration of other texts which some of these early European writers sought and used. And particularly want to emphasize that for most of the missionaries in India, they were not particularly interested in the Veda. And the reason they were not particularly interested in the Veda was because Hindus weren't particularly interested in the Veda. Despite everything that they said about the Veda, very few Hindus had read it and had access to copies of it. The other study of the early European accounts of the Veda is by Dorothy Figueira, a much more recent account. And although I want to develop here her claim that the Veda existed in the European imagination and in speculative thought well before its appearance in translation, she's mostly concerned with slightly later texts. She begins in the 18th century, but she's really interested in the career of the Veda, in the thought of writers in Europe, in the later part of the 18th century and into the 19th century. And the distinction between a European, I would call it almost an obsession with the Veda on the part of Europeans in Europe, is something I want to stress against, or place against what I think is a kind of disregard for the Veda on the part of European missionaries in India. So the idea that the Indians were literate idolaters is very old. It goes back to Duarte Barbosa, who says in 1516 that these Brahmins are learned in their idolatry and possess many books thereof. But it is, as I said, de Coto who I think sets loose in Europe the idea that the fundamental texts which prescribe the religious beliefs and practices of the Gentiles of the East, as he puts it, are the works which he says they call Veda. So he's the first to mention the term Veda. And to specify that these come in 4 parts. The idea of 4 fundamental books was confirmed in the 17th century by European travelers of other nationalities, reflecting the decline of Portuguese power and the rise of the English, Dutch, and French. So in 1615, Edward Terry, a chaplain to the English ambassador to the Mughal court, says the Brahmins talk of 4 books, which about 6,000 years ago were sent them from God by their prophet Ram, whereof 2 were sealed up and might not be opened, the others only to be read by themselves. And then in 1651, a Dutch chaplain, Abraham Rogier, reports for the first time in print in Europe, although de Nobile already knew the names, but it's Rogier who's the first person to put them in print. So the names of the 4 Vedas. Although in fact his account of their contents, which he received at second hand through a Brahmin informant, Padmanabham, appears to reflect rather the content of the South Indian Vaishnava canonical collection, the Prabandham. And this again is a consistent pattern. Europeans ask for the Veda, and what they are given is some kind of substitute. And this is not, I think, a case of Indian informants telling Europeans what they wanted to hear. It's entirely in tune with Hindu ideas that there is, for example, a Tamil Veda. That there are 2 Tamil Vedas, in fact. So there is a Shaiva Veda, which is the Devaram, the canonical Shaiva tradition, and then there is the Prabandham, the text which influenced Rogier's account. And both of these are spoken of by the adherents of these respective traditions as Dravidian Vedas, as Tamil Vedas, which represent the essence of the Veda. So they are the Veda. And it's also the elasticity of the term Veda itself, which simply means knowledge, which allows for this. So there is this consistent kind of pattern of substitution. Rogier is also important because I think it was his text which influenced the commission from the French royal librarian, which set off the French Jesuits in the 18th century, who were eventually the first to recover actual texts of the Veda. But also he was important for the later generation of Protestant missionaries from Halle. Okay, again in the 17th century, the French then, Bernier, who we've mentioned, also names the texts, although he too notes that in fact the Brahmins, he says, generally study the Puranas. So again, this displacement on another text, but then he adds, which is an abridgment and interpretation of the beads. So this idea that the Puranas are different texts, but in some sense they are Veda too. So already at the beginning of the 17th century, however, the Italian Jesuit Roberto Nobili was learning more about the Vedas, and he seems to have been the first one to report an idea which has a long life, which is that of the 4 Vedas, only 3 were extant, and the 4th, which he says was the one required for salvation, had been lost. And this idea is perhaps one reason why he was connected with the Jesuit pseudo-Veda, the Azur Vedam, of the 18th century. In 1619, however, in defending adaptation, he noted that the term Veda is not restricted to the Vedic hymns, the Samhitas, but means knowledge in general. Nobili had access to the Vedas, some degree of access, perhaps it's debatable, through a Telugu Brahmin named Shivadharma, and he reports their names, as I've mentioned, in an unpublished work. But he says little more about them. So as David quoted in the printed version of his paper, apart from what is said here and there about the gods, the sacrifices offered to the gods, and superstitious rites, these books deal a good deal with topics such as the elements, the sun, and other matters of this kind, no mention being made that they are gods. Nobody associated the Vedas, especially with Advaita Vedantins. For Shaivas, however, he reports that their religious texts were the Agamas, for Vaishnavas, the Tiruvaimuri, part of the same Prabandham, and then for Vishnadvaita Vedantins, Madhava's commentary on the Brahma Sutra. However, having mentioned all these texts, he then notes that although by metonymy all these works are identified with the Vedas, and more specifically with the Upanishads, he notes that there is beyond these texts, all of which can be described as Veda, a whole wide variety of other texts which are of practical importance. Now, Indian religious texts have been the object of Jesuit desire since the middle of the previous century, although I think I'll skip this over. There were some texts, the Gita and so on, that were, and Puranas which were recovered, but the Veda proved elusive. Bernier was shown books he believed to be the Vedas in Benares, but he was unable to obtain copies. And he introduces an idea which we've already heard, which is quite familiar. The Gentiles, he says, conceal them with much care, lest they should fall into the hands of the Mohammedans and be burnt, as frequently happens. Bernier, however, is convinced that the Jesuit Heinrich Roth, from whom he had obtained some details of Hindu mythology, had derived his own knowledge from the Vedas, although in fact this seems unlikely. Again, based on what Bernier reports and Roth's other writings, it seems likely that the source is again Puranic literature rather than Vedic. Acquiring a copy of the Veda had also been an early ambition for Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg, the first Protestant missionary. Already in September 1706, which is just 3 months after his arrival in India, Ziegenbalg reported in a letter that books were being copied out for him by the elderly schoolmaster who he had engaged to teach him Tamil. There are two versions of this letter published in 1708, which differ interestingly in the details. The letter includes, however, an account of Brahma's revelation of 4 books, one of which was lost, along with one of Brahma's heads when he contested Shiva's supremacy. So again, this is a familiar myth. Now, in the first version of this letter, we read that while Ziegenbalg asked the schoolmaster to transcribe the remaining 3 books for him, he could not bring himself to do it. It would be against their law to allow a Christian to have access to them. Nevertheless, in the second version of the letter, Ziegenbalg is there recorded as saying that the books are being written out for him, but they're being written out in Tamil. So clearly they're not the Veda, but some substitute for the Veda. Ziegenbalg here states not that it's against their law to transcribe these texts, but only that it's never been done before for any Christian. But because of their great love for him, Ziegenbalg had a reasonable ego, they were prepared to do it for him. The account of their revelation by Brahma suggests, of course, that the 4 books in question are the Vedas, but Ziegenbalg later admits that this is likely to be a detail, an idea that he borrowed from Boldeus, the Dutchman who also used Vinicio's work. Ziegenbalg's description of the content of the books suggests, on the other hand, that rather than copying out the Vedas, the schoolmaster had identified some Tamil texts, as I said, they were written out in Tamil, which he regarded as in some sense equivalent to the Vedas. So again, this kind of substitution. When he began reading Tamil texts for himself, Ziegenbalg quickly lost interest in the Veda. He commented, while the Brahmins make much of the 4 Vedas, they do not allow others even to see, much less to read them. And instead, he says that the key texts for the Tamils are the Puranas, okay, together with the Agamas and Shastras, which are found in all sorts of languages among the non-Brahmins. So although he's aware of Sanskrit and its significance for the Brahmins, Ziegenbalg never seems to have regarded it as important to learn it, and few of his successors in the Tranquebar mission did either. In conversations which took place in 1708, but which were recorded by Ziegenbalg and published in 1715, he even expresses doubts about the very existence of the Veda. So he says, although the Brahmins claim to have this law given to them by God himself, because they don't show it to anybody or teach it to anybody, there must be some doubt, he says. In another discussion with a Brahmin, Ziegenbalg says that he has spoken to many thousands of Tamils, all of whom acknowledge that they have never seen these law books, these Vedas, but they have only heard from other Brahmins that they exist. And the Brahmins who Ziegenbalg himself approached, while professing to be willing to show him these books, excused themselves by saying they didn't have it at hand at the moment, but rather it was with such and such a great Brahmin in a distant place, always a place to which they knew Ziegenbalg could not travel because of the persecutions going on in Tanjore. Therefore, Ziegenbalg says he doubts whether such a book actually exists. But when he puts these doubts to the Brahmin's response is again interesting. What he says is that the book is too deep for people to understand, and it's written in Sanskrit, which cannot be translated into Tamil. Everything necessary for salvation, however, has been extracted from the Vedas, extracted from Sanskrit, and is now available in Tamil texts such as Tiruvasagam, the Tiruvilayadal Puranam, the Tirukural, the Bharatam, and other similar books. The Brahmin was then surprised to discover that Siegenbalg already had copies of these works in Tamil. One of Siegenbalg's successors, a couple of decades later, Benjamin Schulze, expressed similar doubts about the existence of the Veda. So when he was challenged by Schulze to show his law, the Brahmin responded that while they had a law, it was not written but could only be transmitted orally. Schulze then responded that if that was the case, he could say anything he liked and claim that it was the law, and therefore this amounted to having no law at all. And another decade later, in 1734, the next generation of Protestant missionaries in Tranquebar report something similar. For all their efforts, they say, to see the Veda, they've been told that it's not written, but that boys who can only be Brahmins learn sections of it from a priest by repeating it constantly. The language in which it is recorded, which they call Grantha, is so old that no one can understand it without referring to the Shastras. And the fourth part they learned is learned by few because it consists of sorcery. Now this again is fairly consistent with what we know of the Atharva Veda. It's noteworthy that this generation of missionaries had allowed Siegenbalg's extensive collection of Tamil texts to fall into disrepair, to be stolen or even burnt. And they glossed the word Veda here in their account with Hollandische Wet, a Dutch vet, a clear indication that they are here following again the 17th century account of Rogier, which had stoked the idea, I think, in Europe, first sparked by De Coutu, that it was the Veda which was the key text, despite the fact that their predecessor Siegenbalg had correctly identified that the texts of practical importance for Hindu religion were other texts. Now, around the same time, the French Jesuits in the same region, slightly to the north, based in Pondicherry, set out in search of the Veda, not because they were particularly themselves in search of the Veda, but because they had been commissioned from Europe to obtain copies of the Veda. And the original list of Oriental works drawn up in 1719 by Etienne Formont in Paris identifies specific works including the Veda, the Ramayana, the Panchangam, and the works of Bhartrihari. Now, the Veda and Ramayanam had been mentioned in several texts in Europe, but the other two, and particularly the way in which they are spelled, suggest that what Formont had read was again Rogier. So he takes these four, the idea from Rogier that these were the four texts. China took priority, so it took a little while for a list of texts to be sent to India. It's not until 1727 that efforts were made to obtain texts from India. Slightly before this, another one of the French Jesuits, Jean-Venant Boucher, had written a letter to the Bishop of Avranches, Pierre-Daniel Huet, in which he argued that Hindu religious texts were a diabolic imitation of the Christian scriptures. Although the Veda is divided into 4 sections, he asserts that many Indian scholars think that there was formerly a 5th part, now lost, and therefore he concludes that the Veda is nothing other than an imitation of the Pentateuch. And this he proved, at least to his own satisfaction, on the basis of the esteem the Indians had for this law and the rituals were surrounding it. And it's to this esteem that he attributes the fact that he had not been able to obtain copies. But again, from informants, he had learnt enough, he says, about the content of these texts in order to be able to be confident in pronouncing them an imitation of the books of Moses. However, shortly after this, the Jesuit Calmet does obtain for the first time copies of the Veda. So in August of 1730, Calmet reports that he had obtained copies of the first 2 Vedas, which he calls Rugvedam and Yajurvedam. And he says, ever since India has been known, it does not appear that the Europeans have been able to unearth this book, which the Brahms scruple to communicate, and which they transcribe superstitiously in the woods or in remote places where they cannot be seen by any who are not of their caste. Calmet, I think, was successful in managing to obtain copies of the Veda, and by his own account, he says, as he progressed into the hinterland, so these are the stations circled here are his successive missionary stations, and as he moved further and further away from the coastal regions where Europeans were known, he found the Brahmins, it was easier to deal with the Brahmins and to make overtures regarding what they knew and to obtain copies of their books. Nevertheless, it was from a convert that he had been able to obtain copies of the Veda. So the Rigvedam and 3 books of the Yajurvedam appear in the lists of works sent to Europe in 1713. And then in 1735 and 1734, respectively, the Sama Veda, the 3rd, and the Atharva Veda, the 4th, appear. When reporting to Saussure in Paris that he had finally recovered all 4 Vedas, Calmette recounted how just 6 years earlier, 2 missionaries, one in Bengal, who I think must be Pons, and another in the Carnatic, had been deceived into buying texts which purported to be Vedas. So again, this kind of substitution. However, he describes how he confirmed the authenticity of the texts he had purchased by having young Brahmins who were learning the Vedas recite them to him and checking against the texts that he had. Nevertheless, Calmette himself was also deceived, at least in relation to the Atharva Vedam. The text which he deposited in Paris, which is still there, is in fact an assortment of tantric and magical texts connected with goddess worship, which, however, bear the title of Atharva. So Atharvana Tantra Raja and Atharvana Mantra Shastra. So although the Jesuits had thus succeeded finally in obtaining copies of what had been sought for so long, at least in Europe, when Legac, the head of the mission, wrote to Saussure at the Jesuit library of the Collège Louis le Grand to report on the cost of the copies he had made for that library, he confided, "Between ourselves, this is a useless expense. These books can serve as nothing more than a spectacle in a library, for I cannot believe that anyone in Europe could come to understand them properly, whatever aptitude they may have for languages." Legac was correct, not least because the copies which he had been obtained, although they were in Sanskrit, were in the Telugu script, as Calmette had obtained them in the Telugu region. This is actually a Christian text. This is de Nobilis, but it shows you probably written by the same scribe who copied the Vedic text, the Telugu. So even if you could read Devanagari, even if you could read Sanskrit, even if you could read Vedic Sanskrit, you wouldn't be able to read this without knowing the Telugu script. And another Jesuit in the Carnatic mission had previously written to Saussure offering to procure not copies of the Veda, but a translation of them. Kolar suggests that this could only be a translation into Telugu. And in fact, several of the texts which the Jesuits did collect were not so much copies of actual or transcriptions of actual Indian texts, but verbal abstracts of texts produced by scholars and recorded on paper rather than palm leaves by converts. So they were abstracts of text rather than the texts themselves. So Saussure again demonstrates a difference between scholars in Europe and missionaries in India with respect to the Veda. So the initial interest in the Veda, as I said, may have been prompted by Boucher's account of the Veda, published in 1711, or by the wider discussion of the Veda and other ancient texts going back to Dukuto. In 1717, Saussure had written to another Jesuit in India, Louis de Bozes, asking him about the Veda and also about the Parsis. Bozes could say nothing about the Parsis, but the letter that he wrote 2 years later contains a very detailed account of the Veda, which I think demonstrates that at least some of the Jesuits had quite detailed knowledge of the Veda. Bozes, interestingly, attributes most of his knowledge to de Nobili. He begins by reiterating the trope about Brahmin secrecy, stating that it was a maxim among them that to communicate the Veda to others was a crime punishable by many millions of years in hell. And he also mentions the oral nature of transmission, although he adds that one Brahmin has told him that there are texts, or physical texts. He corrects Boucher, without mentioning his name, on the question of whether there were first 5 Vedas, saying that he has inquired diligently into this and has been assured constantly that there are only 4. He notes, however, that a 5th Veda is sometimes spoken of in the way that we, he says, might speak of a poet as a second Virgil. Okay? And he also refers to Bernier. And again, this is a common Indian idea. So the Mahabharata, for example, is spoken of as a 5th Veda, despite not being a Veda per se. He then also notes that the name Veda is applied by extension to a whole range of other texts which are not strictly Veda, and he gives examples from de Nobili, including the Skanda Purana, and again Tiruvaimuri, the Tamil Vaishnava canonical collection. The Veda proper, he says, is never read and expounded to the people. They would not be capable of understanding it. Instead, they read other texts to which the name Veda is lent. In fact, he says that prostituted. Above all, the Ramayana, which he says is called the Vedas of the Shudra, the Veda of the Shudras, okay, so the Veda of the common people, he says. He then gives excuses why he hasn't learned Sanskrit. Tamil, he says, is essential for missionary work, while Sanskrit is difficult and is not going to be very helpful in converting the Hindus. Few Brahmins, he says, know more than 1/4 of the Veda, and one who knows 3 is regarded as a prodigious scholar. He then repeats again that he knows little of the Veda himself. He refers Susier again to another of Boucher's letter, which in fact discusses possession. But he then proceeds to give what is probably the most detailed account yet given of the actual content of the Vedas, including an account which I think must be the first of the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice. He includes also an account of chronology, which is one of the reasons for the intense interest in ancient non-Christian scriptures, and suggests that it may owe something to contacts with China. And he then concludes by noting his astonishment at the conjunctions between Sanskrit and Latin names for numbers, and wonders how this could have happened. So he's sort of gesturing towards Indo-European families. So this concern, and I think I would call it an obsession of Europeans in Europe with the Veda, did not die with the Jesuit dispatch of Vedic texts to Europe. Following the publication in the Lettres édifiantes in 1734 of Calmet's letter announcing that he had obtained copies of the Veda for the Royal Library, Ziegenbalg's successors, so the rivals to the Catholics, were spurred to go one better by offering a translation of the Yajur Veda. So not just the text, but actually a translation. I think it's likely that this was prompted by one of their correspondents in Europe who had seen Calmet's letter, because the missionaries who offered this translation of the Veda had previously evinced no particular interest in Indian literature. The text was translated for them by a Brahmin named Krishna after much persuasion, and again his reluctance alone they argue was proof that this must be the true Veda. In fact, although Krishna appears to have been a Brahmin of the Taittiriya branch of the Yajur Veda, the text, which was published in Germany in the Hallische Berichte, the missionary reports, has in fact, as one modern scholar said, not the slightest thing to do with the Yajur Veda. Instead, it's an encyclopedic and systematically ordered representation of the modern Brahminical world and life view. So again, a substitution. The content of the Veda, the truth of the Veda, the essence of the Veda, but not what we would understand as the Veda in the sense strict. But I think it's to illustrate this, the continuing hold of the Veda in Europe. The best thing to look at is not the true Veda, but the pseudo Veda, right? The Jesuit Yajur Veda. Despite the doubts which were raised by Sonnerat, who in 1782 suggested correctly that this was a book of controversy written by a missionary, the Yajur Veda, of course in the hands of Voltaire, was an important source in Europe and was still defended as late as 1808 by Anquetil du Perron, who had actually translated Upanishads from Persian into Latin, but nevertheless accepted the authenticity of this, or defended the authenticity of this text. By then, however, Henry Colebrook's landmark study of the Vedas had appeared in the Asiatic Researchers in 1805, described by one scholar as an extraordinarily comprehensive survey of Vedic literature. Colebrook's sober, scholarly account, however, still did not break the grip that the Veda held on Europe's imagination. Max Müller sighed that people went on dreaming about the Veda instead of reading Colebrook's essays. And although the Veda had not yet broken through to the kind of recognition in Europe that Müller himself would achieve for it, Luder-Rogier argues that Müller not only established the Veda's fame in Europe, but also created a totally new interest in it in India, not least by choosing to publish it together with a full commentary. And Rogier suggests that it's, for a number of reasons other than religious scruple, for the difficulty that Europeans experience in attempting to obtain copies of the Veda. Among them, he says, is simple lack of knowledge of the Veda, despite its acknowledged authority amongst Indians. In this sense, in Dorothy Figueira's language, the Veda was an absent text not only for Europeans, but for Indians, Hindus too. The practical significance of other texts, these substitutes, is suggested repeatedly by the focus of missionaries in India on those texts rather than the Veda.
Okay, once again, we'll have 5 minutes of questions specifically addressed to Will. And then we'll open it up for a short period of general questions to the people on the panel.
Well, this comment isn't exclusively about what Will has just talked about, but it's connected to it. And one thing I think is fairly obvious comparing China and India is that the missionaries in India did not have access to the best scholars in India. And I think there's lots of reasons why this may be the case. And just the way scholarship was decentralized in India in a way that it wasn't in China, apparently. So there were really Brahmins who knew the Vedas, knew Sayana's commentary, but apparently none of these missionaries had direct contact with these people. This is a problem which continues on until the 19th century, I think. And another thing that is interesting to me is that the question of allegorical interpretations of Scripture. I think this is a problem both for India and for Christian Europe. When exactly did allegorical interpretations take the place of literal interpretation? There's obviously a problem with Christianity in the story of Noah and the ark, and this whole idea of Christian history going back to 4004 BC or whatever it could be. This was basically exploded by archaeologists and others in the 19th century, but already Voltaire was very skeptical about the whole thing, among others. But these missionaries were obviously using empirical knowledge about astronomy or about lots of other sort of things, and contrasting that with Hindu myths or Hindu legends, for instance, about Rama, the giants, Ravana, 7 heads, all that stuff. So I think for most, for more learned Hindus, these things were already in terms of allegories, and this, so that the Christians were making arguments against the Hindus using a very simple-minded interpretation of, or literal interpretation of what these legends said, whereas they weren't willing to do it, obviously, for the Christian Bible. And I think that whole question needs to be examined in much more detail when allegorical interpretations became important, who was making them, and so on.
Would you like to comment?
To respond on the first point, yeah, no doubt there were people who knew the Veda in India and throughout this period. The point rather is that if from a practical point of view, if you want to convert Hindus, the texts that are important to them are not Vedic texts. I mean, I was thinking, I was forgetting whose paper I was listening to, but I was thinking about, it may have been yours when you were talking about, you know, the Hindu in this dialogue is never given the chance to put forward good arguments. But if he were, for example, to launch an assault on the dietary laws of Leviticus, you know, as a way of refuting Christianity, I mean, that's what I think, you know, attacking the Veda would have been for most, you know, if they had, you know, said the horse sacrifice is, you know, nonsensical. Most people would have said, well, Rama didn't perform a horse. Well, there are maybe, I don't know. But I think if you were looking for the practical text, if you really want to engage with the majority of the population of India, even of the elites, certainly in the south, I mean, it's not, well, the non-Brahmin elites surely were not interested in the Veda. They had these, you know, Tiruvaimuri, the Devaram and other texts. That was where the, you know.
Another question specifically for Will? Yes.
Thanks, Bill, for this fascinating talk. I think that it's time someone sorts out the story of the Vedas. So I think that, I mean, in a sense, we have fragments everywhere and references everywhere. It's very good to see it all brought together, really. My question is, I mean, the way, I mean, I think it's interesting the suggestion you're making that not only did the missionaries not find it difficult to have access to the Vedas, but also it was not particularly important, at least in the areas of India where they were active, in terms of everyday religious life, I would say. But surely the Vedas did have an importance as a way of establishing the authority of the Brahmins as having access to the ultimate authority in their religious system. So surely, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that rather than the immediate practical uses of the Vedas, it may have been that the Vedas were important as a way of establishing authority. They were the ultimate authority within a very multi-layered textual system, and those who possessed control of those texts, whatever they did with it in practice, had access to the ultimate authority, therefore they were the ultimate authority. So socially, they were crucial.
But this is exactly why, if you want to establish the authority of another text, Tiruvaimuri, you call it a Veda. Right? The Veda retains this iconic authority. And it is the reason why, the idea gets set loose in Europe that the Veda is the fundamental text, because that is what you will hear. But I think it's probably a tribute to the missionaries' deepening knowledge of India, that they, I mean, as you see, de Nobili has this, he's fully aware that these texts are not Veda, but that they are called Veda. And he gives a whole list of synonyms for Veda, knowing that these are not the hymns, right? This is not the Samhitas, but yeah. So, yes, I agree that the Veda retains this authority, but it is kind of lip service, even on the part of some Brahmins, I would say. They teach the text, but they're not performing Agnishtoma. What they do in the temples, if they do temple worship at all, is entirely different.
That's what I'm saying, that it's no longer a practical, exoteric kind of ritual as much as being able to claim to know the ultimate version, original version of the ritual in the most sacred language. Basically, it's about being able to say we have access to these deeper kind of like superior. I'm struggling to find the words that would be the right words for a Brahmin. But what I'm trying to say is that it's the social authority of the Brahmins, of the ultimate religious authority, that I think is crucial, even if the practical life is not so. And that's why restricting access is important, isn't it?
It is, and there's no doubt. Manu talks about pouring molten lead into the ears of Shudras if they chance to hear the Veda. But I think it's also simply the case that this idea that the Brahmins said, "Oh, we don't have it on hand at the moment." I think this is actually, contrary to telling the missionaries what they want to hear. I think this is, disguising the fact that personally they don't have, access to partly because it's still an oral tradition.
Well, if you're a Brahmin who doesn't have access, you will hide it, because it will beg you less of a Brahmin.
Well,
in the same line.
yeah, okay, but I'm just going to say that we're almost 7 o'clock, but I'm going to open it up. Open it up to anyone can ask questions of any of the panel members, and let's go on for another 10 minutes, but of course anyone who needs to leave can. So, yeah.
No, this is just a note to the question of money, because it is I wonder if you agree with me that the moment the Jesuits finally got their hands on the Vedas in the 18th century is when they had this huge influx of money coming from Europe to buy these curious books for the library of the king. And this was the first time they had real money, and they were able to send in the word all the way to Karnataka, we are buying. And you said the further they were going into inland, they had better relationship with Brahmins. Yeah, but finally it was the converted Brahmins who procured those texts. And this is where the money, this is where the Vedas come from, with money. There is a kind of a market. And then when you think about later on what happens in the north and Polier, this is also the moment when you have a real bazaar, what Muzaffar Alam calls a bazaar. And so, you know, people were able to buy this kind of manuscripts. I don't know if you agree.
I do, except, I mean, it's Calmet himself who says, as I go into the hinterland, all I did was track his journey, but the convert from whom he obtained the texts was only able to get them because it wasn't known that he was a convert. And if he had been in Pondicherry, I think that would have been harder to get away with, so, yeah.
There was money.
But there was money, and there are, you know, there are hints. So Boucher inquires about the Veda, you know, a couple of decades earlier. But you know, Legac writes. I mean, he writes to both Foumont and Sucier to say, don't worry about these Vedas. You know? we'll get you better texts.
No, because he wants to spend this money on something useful for the mission, and not
they had
King's Library.
They had also been commissioned to get the Ramayana and to get, you know, Panchangam, which is, I mean, a weird suggestion, right? And only explicable because of Ruqayya, but yeah.
Okay, questions for anyone on the panel?
Exhausted you.
Adrian?
I do understand that this text of Mirada was written backward, right? Text mentioned at all in Akbar's biography? So, what are the words to describe this text to me?
It is actually not mentioned in Akbar's biography, but it is mentioned in Jahangir's biography and in Majalis Jahangiri. It is mentioned in the discussions that Jahangir had with all these other various religious specialists, and that Abdus Sattar recorded. There it is mentioned with the name. Of course, Abdus Sattar is co-writer according to Xavier. Because Xavier, in the last sentence of the text, he says, I wrote this with Abdus Sattar al-Lahori.
Read the text to Akbar.
Who read?
Yeah, I mean, Akbar couldn't read. Somebody had to read it.
No, but the texts were read. The texts were read and discussed. It doesn't have to be, you know, it's not personal reading. You're not personal. It's not personal reading. I mean, this is for Akbar, and for reading it, whoever, I mean, at kind of public meetings, or it didn't have to be, it's not private reading for Akbar. In any case, it was a gift, but what Akbar did with it, whether he read it, it's not really clear. But he maybe looked at the pictures, because there were beautiful pictures inside, and then you could. But all this question about Akbar being illiterate, there are all kinds of, you know, there are different theories about literacy, because he was highly educated. So how was he, why was he illiterate? There are different schools of thought on his illiteracy.
Yes.
May I?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question for you, Jean-Paul. I'm wondering about, let's say, long-range exchanges of this ethnographic literature, the relations and things like this. Concretely, I'm thinking, for example, about the problems faced by the Jesuits in the South American missions, where they find, let's say, the degree zero of idolatry. They don't know what to do, because that doesn't look like a religion, doesn't look like anything they have seen in other places. And do you think people, for example, in South America are reading what their brothers are writing in India or in China and so on?
Well, in the case of the New Spain and Peru, they definitely read about China because the connection through Manila was very important. I mean, one of the earliest discussions in Europe about the Chinese system of writing comes from José de Costa's Natural Moral History of the Indies. That is because he's spoken to Alonso Sanchez, who's come from the Philippines, and there is a continuous flow of information between the Philippines and Mexico, and I mean, New Spain again, and then, I mean, no doubt, and also the Jesuits used letters for edification across the missions. So there was a lot of reading about other missions. In Europe, of course, young people who aspire to be missionaries would read quite extensively. It would depend which particular missions were publishing at a particular time. I mean, of course, there was a time for Japan, which was the late 16th century, and then there was a time for China, which was the late, well, throughout much of the 17th century, I would say. There was a time for Nouvelle France. So there was different moments when different missions were more sexy, let's put it this way. But I think that there was there was an internal communication, and there was also participation in the Republic of Letters, because it was necessary for the apologetics of the Jesuits to engage not only the infidels but also the atheists at home increasingly. So that all of that meant, for example, the Lettres édifiantes des Curieux are mixing all these different regions, and you will buy a little booklet or you will read one and you will find the Nouvelle France, and then next day you'll find India, and the next day you find China. So no doubt that perspective was possible. Other religious orders is more complicated. And here we come where maybe there is a difference when it comes to the Jesuits, which is less with what they did in practice sometimes than the way they projected their knowledge. I mean, they were definitely much more successful in projecting their knowledge through letter writing and in publications, the Jesuits, than any other order. They were much more better organized and much more devoted to that. So that, I mean, a lot of what the Franciscans did got lost or was not published. We know now a lot about Bernardino Sahagún, all these people, but who read Bernardino Sahagún in the 16th century?
I have a question for Thomas. If from the cases that you have studied, you have evidence of the fact that astronomy and mathematics were part of a wider educational strategy, a wider educational project. In fact, the establishment of learning institution is very much part of the Jesuits' mission. It's part of their own identity. They wanted to have colleges in order to educate native clergy, for example. In Japan, Pedro Gomes was teaching theory of planets. Natural philosophy was taught at Macau. Wu Li took classes in natural philosophy. There is evidence of that in his poems. So even Chinese converts, where colleges were established, they were taking class. So especially when you speak of astronomy being a personal pursuit, have you been able to collect further evidence or evidence of the fact that this was actually part of a larger educational project?
The short answer is not yet, but I think this is a very important line of research because, well, first of all, this educational thing you were talking about, I think it's crucial to understand, let's say, the performance of missionaries, because it's highly non-homogeneous in Europe. the college system, when you go to details, you get to see that, for example, in Spain and Portugal, very few colleges had the philosophical chair, the philosophical course with mathematics, natural philosophy, and astronomy. And yeah, in Lisbon and Coimbra, yeah, but in several places they just didn't have this this background, which is very different from the German assistancy, where most of the colleges had an almost permanent philosophical course, a philosophy chair, which was always occupied. And in the missions, things are also, as far as I can tell presently, also highly non-homogeneous. For example, the colleges in America, and especially in Brazil, where I come from, well, in Brazil there were around 8 colleges, I don't remember now, and just one of them had a philosophy chair. In Asia, okay, there is Goa and Macau and several places where, yeah, exactly. But, for example, this character, Cristoforo Borri, he was connected to, let's say, this network from his early years, from his student years, where we know he attended a philosophy course in this sense of natural philosophy and mathematics and astronomy. He taught this in Milan before going to Asia, and he always kept connected to this network, or to this piece of the Republic of Letters, how like he said now. But I think several other missionaries just were not trained to do this, were not interested, were not connected to any sort of network where this kind of thing was circulating. And this is the case, for example, of Fenicio. If you read his astronomy, it's really basic astronomy. It's not comparable to even an elementary sphere course that we can find in the late 16th century and all along the 17th. So.
Okay, are there any more pressing questions? Then if not, I think we'll call it a night, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. And thank you all.